Hey nerds. So, going to talk today about Nietzsche's criticism of Stoics, which should be exciting. So, yeah, before we get started, order if you happen to be ordering anything on Amazon anyway, you can order anything at all through my link and it gives me a little kickback and no extra cost to you, so please do that. Please subscribe, that helps a lot. Please tip on Patreon for individual videos if you like one more than the other, and you can give me any amount of Patreon per month. That's really helpful too. And check out my Rumble page too. All those links are in the description. All right, so I'm going to talk about this really interesting philosopher from the channel called Philosophize This, and he's going into Nietzsche's criticism of Stoics on rationalism, which is really interesting. Of course, Nietzsche almost needs no introduction, but for those who don't know, he's basically the famous 19th century existentialist who famously went mad and ended up being like institutionalized, and his sister edited his final work, I think The Will to Power, that he didn't complete. So she posthumously edited it to make it sound more favorable to Hitler, and then he used portions of it in his speeches, and that's why there are inaccurately right-wing interpretations of Nietzsche. But anyway, so of course, Stoics, an ancient type of ancient Greek philosophy, I like a lot of what they say. This idea that life is hard, so you should focus on the things that you can control and not focus on the things that you cannot control. And there's a lot of good stuff in there, but I think there are definitely some valid criticisms of it, and Nietzsche gets into it here. But before, he's basically talking about contrasting criticisms of Stoicism, basically Nietzsche's criticism uh versus Schopenhauer's criticism. Of course, Schopenhauer, probably the founder or at least one of the most famous pessimists, and I'll probably get into Schopenhauer's opinion on it next time. I'll just get into Nietzsche's opinion this time. But yeah, he's going to get into Nietzsche's really interesting criticism here of what I would say is the fundamental flaw of Stoicism's or Stoics, I should say, view on rationalism.
So, this podcast is kind of a part two of last episode we did, talking about Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Today, we're talking about the rebuttal to all that by Friedrich Nietzsche and Arthur Schopenhauer. Just to be clear, the two of them never collabed on any of this stuff. This is taken from each of their work individually, and it's woven together here today because they represent such different arguments about why they thought the Stoics were wrong. Which, to put it in a single sentence that I'll spend the rest of this episode today explaining, Friedrich Nietzsche thought the Stoics weren't life-affirming enough in their view of the world, and so robbed themselves of some of the most critical aspects of life.
See, that's an ironic sounding criticism on the face of it, right? They weren't life affirming enough, even though this one of the main aspects of the Stoic philosophy is being very life affirming, right? Trying to do what you can to mostly just control and have discipline in life. That's how they see the idea of life affirmation. But he's going to get at what are some good critiques of that in terms of basically kind of in terms of interpreting life, affirming your life in a different way, I'd say. But it's still a good criticism.
Arthur Schopenhauer thought that the Stoics were too life-affirming, of worldly things at least, in a way that prevents a Stoic from ever really understanding the world at a deep level. There's obviously
So Nietzsche thought Stoics were not life affirming enough. Schopenhauer thought Stoics were too life affirming. Very contrasting, but both interesting criticisms of Stoicism's view on reason from totally opposite directions, obviously.
much more to it, but this bird's eye view of the whole thing can be helpful to have at the start sometimes, I think, and we'll understand it by the end of the episode. I'm going to start with some Nietzsche here today, though. And maybe the best place to start is to say that, the Stoics are pretty good candidates for being the poster children of one of the biggest problems Nietzsche had with the entire history of Western philosophy. See, by the time Nietzsche's doing his work in the late 1800s, he thought there'd been over 2,000 years of decline in Western thinking, and along with it, a decline in...
Of course, that's pretty arrogant, but he has some interesting perspectives on that in many of his books, including particularly Beyond Good and Evil, along with others. He's basically mentioning Nietzsche's criticisms of Stoicism views on reason from his book called Beyond Good and Evil.
Western civilization, I guess. He called it decadence, though it has nothing to do with decadence, as we might use that word today in English. Decadence was a sign of a physiological and cultural decline that's gone on in people over time. The world's become a place, apparently, where there are more and more people who over-intellectualize about everything, more people who have weakened drives, a weak sense of vitality, far more weakness of the will going on, more people that spend their time morally judging other people rather than doing the things themselves. There's many more examples of decadence than this, but this all originated, Nietzsche thought.
This seems like, basically what Nietzsche means by decadence is like lacking discipline and focusing on the wrong things and deluding yourself and being a hypocrite, sort of things like that, rather than I don't know, you could say ostentatious hedonism or something like that if you're talking about the colloquial understanding of decadence rather than decadence. It's kind of like the Nietzsche's Nietzsche's definition of what he calls difference rather than difference. And, in a nutshell, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but difference is sort of like more different than different, if I remember correctly. So yeah, Nietzsche always has some very interesting new philosophical words, which is obviously what philosophers do all the time. They invent new words.
People like Socrates and Plato, who started this trend of people being practically obsessed with the idea that there must be some kind of rational, stable order to the way that things play out in the universe.
Yeah, this is interesting. This is like the classic view or the classic split in Western philosophy going all the way back to ancient Greek. Even the pre-Socratics before Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato is this idea of dualism, this idea that the mind and the body are separate in terms of philosophy of consciousness, this idea that the mind and the body are separate and we must control our rational minds and have our rational minds rule over our weak bodies that we need to have discipline over, that sort of thing. That's the idea behind rationalism, which is obviously false because our bodies are just as much a part of ourselves as our brains are not. Our brains are not separate from our body. They're part of the same thing. We're all one thing and they're not separate. And he's about to get into more detail about some key criticisms of rationalism specifically here.
Now, how could those two things be connected? Well, look, don't get him wrong. Nietzsche is by all means a fan of rationality as a tool we can use to shape our this trend of people being practically obsessed with the idea that there must be some kind of rational, stable order to the way that things play out in the universe. Now, how could those two things be connected? Well, look, don't get him wrong. Nietzsche is by all means a fan of rationality as a tool we can use to shape our thinking. He thinks obviously we need it, but he thinks that if
you can think that there are fundamental flaws in rationality without throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Obviously, thinking rationally is a good thing to aspire to do, as long as you don't think that thinking rationally is the be all and end all way of the most enlightened way of thinking that you're going to use to figure out everything in the way of the world. Just don't go crazy with it. You don't need to be a relativist in terms of rational, whether throwing out rationalism or something like that, but it's good to practice it. But it's also important to remember that the idea of rationalism is very biased.
They treated reason as though it's the tool that can explain all of reality for you.
Reason.
Then you're always going to be missing out on all sorts of more dynamic pieces of our reality that are just unfolding in every moment. Creativity, improvisation, instinct, passion. In other words, anything about reality at the level of becoming and emergence. It's people ignoring these important pieces of reality in favor of the rational that's a big contributor to this cultural decline. Turns out these things are very important for our understanding of life.
So this obsession of rationalism is leading to decadence or cultural decline in the way that Nietzsche explained it, this obsession with over-intellectualizing things, lack of discipline, focusing on the wrong things, all that kind of stuff he views as decadence, right? So the decline of Western civilization or Western culture, you could say, according to Nietzsche.
And it's right here at the metaphysical level that we can start to see the first glimmers of where Nietzsche's going to think the Stoics went wrong. It's in these classic concepts of being versus becoming. The question is, how do you think about the universe? Well, the Stoics viewed it mostly in terms of being. Nietzsche's going to view it in terms of becoming. What's meant by this is that the Stoics are always trying to direct their behavior towards something static that they think exists out there in a stable way, whether that's apatheia, whether that's being in alignment with nature or the divine logos, whether that's just those four cardinal virtues of Stoicism and justice, courage,
And
wisdom.
Stoics also like basically view like divine, even divine nature as being ordered through reason and rationality.
And temperance. Point is, the Stoics have a way of looking at their place in the world where they're always aiming to be something. Again, it's being, not becoming. They believe it's possible for them to do the work every day and eventually be in alignment with virtue. Now, if you're Nietzsche, whenever someone starts talking like this, they're always imposing some kind of rational order onto the true indifference and flux of the universe.
That's an important point too. And also in terms of this distinction between being and becoming, it's interesting. It's not like being in like the Heideggerian sense, and it's not becoming in the way that some other continental philosophers who I've mentioned look at it. So like they view Stoics, like he was saying, view being as like basically this static order and nature of the universe. So they're trying to become as rational and reasonable as possible in order to become this like enlightened visual that operates purely on reason, isn't infected by emotions. But Nietzsche was saying that this is what the Stoics believe to be the static nature of the universe, but the universe is always becoming, and people are always becoming. There isn't like a final point at which you stop changing. And there's like we can't just look at this in that particular way. But like I said, that's what he means by being. He doesn't mean like capital B being in terms of the Heideggerian sense, which is a very different sort of semi metaphysical understanding of it. But that's a very good explanation from Nietzsche about the difference between those two types of worldviews.
Trying to make it into something more stable than it actually is. Nietzsche thinks this is naive. See, he's more in the camp of thinking where transformation of any type, personal or otherwise, is something that's always iterative. It's constantly in a state of unfolding. It's not something you can arrive at, and it's not really something you can nail down with a set of rational protocols even if you wanted to. In other words, Nietzsche doesn't think the Stoics take the indifference and emergence of the universe seriously enough. He has this great section.
That's interesting because like the Stoic view is sort of that the universe is indifferent, so we should try to be like mentally more indifferent because they think that this is like the rational order of the universe. But Nietzsche is saying that it's not the rational order of the universe to be indifferent. So you're trying to be rational and reasonable, even that's not actually in accordance with the nature of the universe. The nature is to be indifferent, not rational. You see, like Stoics connect the rational, and that in that sense, they connect the rational with being part of the divine order of the universe. But Nietzsche's saying no, that even if there not even is necessarily any divine order in the universe, it's indifferent. So rationalism is actually against the order of the nature, the divine order of the universe, you see?
And Beyond Good and Evil when he's talking about this Stoic idea where, when external things happen to us, well, we can't control them, right? Because they're a part of nature. And because they're a part of nature, they belong in a class of things that the Stoics call indifference. Meaning when it comes to nature unfolding in the way that it does, we can't say whether these things are good or bad. The only thing we can say is good or bad are the reactions that a person has to what happens. A good Stoic, then, learns to accept these indifferents for what they are. And hopefully, even one day, if they're a really good Stoic, they can learn to love the events of nature in the spirit of the Stoic concept of amor fati. But Nietzsche asks, how is it?
Nietzsche's going to get into a really good criticism of this idea of amor fati, even though he agrees with this idea of amor fati, but he's thinking that basically the Stoics are pursuing what is not actually their true fate. They're using their ideological, philosophical bias to think that this is what their fate, but this is what but their fate they think is connected to being. Whereas you could say that Nietzsche thinks embracing your fate is actually attached to becoming in an indifferent sense. not being in a rational or reasonable sense.
Possible for someone to align their behavior with something indifferent. I mean, what are we doing here? Either this is a benevolent, rational order that we need to be modeling our behavior after, or it's indifferent. And when it comes down to it, Nietzsche's not trying to pick on the Stoics specifically. It's not like the Stoics are especially wrong here to him. To Nietzsche, they're just doing what human beings do. They're exercising their will to power. They're creating a set of values and an ethics that goes along with them. And then they're projecting those values onto the universe and mistaking them as being written into the universe.
He's hating the game, not the player.
And that's not just Stoicism. How about Christianity, Vedism, Kantian ethics? Practically everyone is doing the same thing for Nietzsche. It's just the Stoics do it with a rational divine logos at the bottom. The Stoics will sit around, giving themselves a round of applause when their values seem to be there, when they see rationality.
See, the rational divine logos, the problem of that with that also is that it's a foundationalist philosophy, meaning you could say that it's a Kantian style synthetic a priori claim, which means you can just assume that it's true without actually having to prove that it's true through evidence or reason. So that's a really big problem with foundationalism, which is the main foundation of rationalism, which is why it's one of the main fundamental problems with Stoicism in the same sense.
In an ecosystem or with how the planets orbit or something. But then when the hurricane rolls through town and decimates everything in its path, oh, well, that belongs to the indifferent category. I may prefer for the hurricane to not carry grandma away.
See, they're deciding themselves based on their philosophical bias what is defined as reason and what is defined as indifference, right?
Along with the spare bedroom of the house. But look, this is not something I can really say is good or bad. And yet you should structure your life around emulating it, Nietzsche might ask. For Nietzsche, everything in Stoicism begins from assuming that there's a rational order to things that we have absolutely no reason to be assuming. And this assumption has real impacts on the experience of a Stoic and the place they always need to be orienting.
This assumption of rationality is a Kantian style a priori faith claim, which means it's false on the face of it, basically.
Things in their life from. Maybe the most obvious place you can see this is in the very different ways that the Stoics and Nietzsche talk about the concept of amor fati. Remember, the Stoics say, you should embrace everything that comes your way. Love your fate, they say. Because all this that's going on is a part of the rational order of the universe, whether you realize why it's happening or not. So you can see they start by projecting a metaphysics onto things where everything is rational. And then only from there will they say to love it because it's rational. But the amor fati of Nietzsche...
They have a rationalistic metaphysics, even though they wouldn't necessarily look at it that way. But Stoics do have a very interesting metaphysical system, but this is a very interesting criticism of it here.
Nietzsche, he says, is far more radical than that. He wants to love his fate, whether it's rational or not, whether it's order, disorder.
Yeah, see, the Stoics accept what they see as their rational fate, but Nietzsche is saying, I accept my fate whether it's rational or not. Your fate can be irrational, right? So, and it can not be based on reason. It can be totally random and surprising and not be based on reason at all. So your fate doesn't necessarily actually have anything to do with reason at all, which is very true, I'd say.
Chaos. I mean, to Nietzsche, to say that nature is indifferent and then to really take that statement seriously, that means you'd be someone who would affirm reality, whether there was some kind of ultimate rational plan to it or not. And the challenge Nietzsche puts out there for people is for you to live so passionately, so affirming of anything necessary the universe throws your way, that you don't need any sort of transcendent purpose that makes things feel more palatable to you. You wouldn't have a need to try to control and govern down what a human life is just to make it something more manageable. And this critique obviously extends beyond just Stoicism to any approach that does this, like the more religious ones we just mentioned. In fact, Nietzsche says at one point that the people who are often attracted to Stoicism are people that see life as a state of peril, like something they need to escape. And to him, they're willing to use this rationality of theirs to practice what he calls a kind of self-tyranny, just so they can avoid a world where they have to face the irrational side of existence head on.
See, that's interesting, right? They have like this tyranny working over themselves in the form of extreme self-discipline to avoid the irrational aspects of fate. So they think that fate should be rational based on their ideology, right? But Nietzsche is saying, I embrace my fate whether it's rational or not. And you're torturing yourselves by trying to make everything rational. Just accept the way things actually are. Indifferent, which you claim to believe, but you don't actually believe as Stoics because you think that the world is naturally rationalistic, which is not actually true because you're imposing that ideological view of metaphysics onto the world.
Because think of the move the Stoics often find themselves doing in the name of being a more moral person. They encounter something in the world that makes them feel intense anger, or desire, or fear, or any of these emotions that are part of an everyday human experience. And their job is to govern these emotions down, correct the mistaken judgment that's at the heart of them, so they can get back to the rational, calm, centered experience that Stoics say is an acceptable experience to have. Should anything in their life, like say a romantic relationship, not operate from a place of cultivating virtue, then to remain in that relationship for too long for a Stoic is something immoral that needs to be corrected. For example, say you're an imperfect.
Okay, so yeah, I'll stop there. He's about to get into examples, but I think you get the point. Yeah, so yeah, this is really interesting. Getting into Nietzsche's criticisms of Stoicism, which I don't remember from when I read Beyond Good and Evil before. So it's good to always review philosophy books. And yeah, it's interesting. I think Nietzsche makes a very valid criticism, and he's not saying like screw Stoicism. It has some good aspects, which I agree with, but he's basically like exposing the fundamental flaws of Stoicism, which is that if you want to truly embrace fate, amor fati, you have to also embrace the truth that the universe is indifferent and the universe is becoming. The universe is not static and rationalistic. So embrace not just the rational, but the irrational too. So this is why I think Nietzsche's view on amor fati is a lot better. Embrace all aspects of your fate. I don't necessarily agree with the actual term amor fati, but Nietzsche's way of understanding it makes more sense because you can't control reality, so accept what happens to you with actual indifference, not rationality, right? So yes, Nietzsche destroys the rationalistic delusions of Stoicism and exposes the true nature of amor fati. So, amor fati, bitch.